A well-educated workforce is an absolute necessity for a developing economy, for a developed economy, for anybody who wants to develop. Is it really true though? Does more education really add to the richness, to the national prosperity of a country? I think we all have been stereotyped into thinking that the more we educate ourselves, the better it is for everyone. But actually, there's no empirical evidence which suggests that there's a relationship between economic development of a country, between the national prosperity and the level of educational attainment. It may sound very counterintuitive, but there has been research which has proved this point. Professor Pratchell, who teaches at Harvard University and has himself got a PhD in developmental economics, he did a research spanning between 1980s to about 2000, and he concluded that there is no data which can suggest that there is a direct relationship between the GDP of a country and the education level of that country. Now, why do we think, in general, that it feels like a common sense that the more we study, the more degrees we have, the better it is for us and for the country? I think this misconceptions arises because we see from our own eyes that the developed countries like America, UK, Germany, France, all the OECD countries, the miracle economics of East Asian countries like Korea, Japan, Singapore, etc., they have got a very good education system, and compared the same with one of the poorest economies of the world, the sub-Saharan economies. There, the educational level is very bad, very poor in comparison to these countries. And therefore, we automatically assume that the more we educate ourselves, the more the educated workforce is, the better it is for the country's economic development. I mean, we see that the average schooling in the OECD countries is like 9 years of education, whereas the average schooling years in the sub-Saharan countries is not even 3 years, it is less than 3 years. And you see that where both these geographical area stand on their economic development. Clearly the one with higher level of educational years is doing much better than the one with the less number of years in school. So this sort of correlation makes us think that more education means more prosperity. But let me give you 2 examples. In the 1960s, Philippines had a literacy rate of 72%, and its per capita GDP was about $200 per head. In the same time period, Taiwan, its literacy rate was only 52%, like 20 percentage point less than Philippines, and its per capita GDP was almost half of Philippines, about $120 per head. But soon, after 60s, the economics of Taiwan was developing in leaps and bounds, even though its people were less educated in general than the Filipinos. And by 2000 or 2010, the per capita GDP of Taiwan is 10 times that of Filipino, $18,000 per head compared to $1,800 of Filipinos, whereas their educational attainment, more or less, is at par. Take another example, South Korea. Its literacy rate was about 72% in the 60s, and Argentina, which was doing quite well in the 60s and 70s, its literacy level was close to or more than 90%, and its per capita GDP was close to $400, whereas South Korea was less than $100. But South Korean economies overtook Argentina much faster, even though educationally it was much lower level, at a much lower level compared to Argentinian people. So we think that more education is better, but that is not always the case. Not all education are same. There are certain subjects which adds no value to a labor force productivity. Take for example the subjects like history or music or arts or other humanities subjects. They are not going to make the labor force more productive. Or even subjects like science and maths, which are supposed to add to the productivity of labor force. Even those subjects are not necessarily equally important for all the labor force. Some of these subjects may be important for people like in the engineering domain or maybe in the finance domain, but not for everyone. For example, an investment banker, he does not need to know what's going on in the human body. Even if he has done a PhD in biology, that is of no use to him. Or for that matter, the knowledge of quantum physics is of no use to a fashion designer. What essentially I'm trying to say is not all education is the same. What is important is the kind of education which helps you become more productive, more organized, more disciplined. They are the sort of education which helps you being more productive and therefore adding into the economic growth of the country. Take another example. The literacy rate in Africa in the 1980s was about 40%. And the government in those countries at the time, they were focused on improving the educational standards, on improving the literacy. And in 20 years, from 1980 to 2000, around 2004, their literacy rate jumped from, on an average, from 40% to 80%. Sorry, from 40% to 60%. And we would assume that because of the increase in the literacy rate, because of the increase in the education and average education of its masses, the economy would do well. But actually, if you measure the per capita GDP, it actually decreased by 0.3% during the same time period. And I think that proves my point, that not all education are the same. Some are more important than the other. Take another example of a country like Switzerland. It is one of the richest and most industrialized country in the world. But do you know that only about 13% of its population goes to university compared to about 39 or 40% of other OECD countries? And yet, it is one of the most sophisticated, highly advanced economy in the world. Even though, if we compare how many people go into the university, it lags far behind even in comparison to some of the poorer countries like Lithuania or Czechoslovakia or Serbia. In the nutshell, what I'm trying to say is education is good. A basic education is necessary, but if you keep adding more and more and more of it, that is not necessarily going to add any value to it. So we may be fooled into thinking that just because the students in the Asian economies like Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, etc., they are doing so much better in math and science compared to other regions, their economy is doing well, and therefore everyone should focus on making its population well educated. That is not going to work. You have to think, we have to think, what kind of education is going to make the labor force more productive? That is the key word. The productivity is the key word. If education is not going to make you productive, add value in the economy, then just on monetary basis, it is of no use. It may help you to become more enriched. You can say, well, the knowledge of history and literature and arts and music and etc. is going to make your life more holistic. Well, I do not disagree with that. What I disagree is it may not be actually helping you make money, which translates into richness. So, what is the takeaway from all this? I think my takeaway is, if I have to advise anyone, any country, I would say focus on vocational education. Focus on education which imparts skills, which helps people become more productive at whatever things or whatever work they are going to do. Focus on making people join enterprises, being entrepreneurial. Focus on making the society more business oriented. The countries and the government and the policymakers have to think that how can they make the people organize themselves into enterprises? How can they put systems and policies in place which help everybody build organizations and companies which can survive on a free market economy? There has to be laws and regulation in place. There has to be systems and procedures in place. Not just making everybody a PhD, simply making everybody educated is going to work. That is what is my takeaway.